that we learned about, which is the sum method. And remember that the sum method returns true or false, and so that's great for doing an if check like this. So here we can check if state.bookmarks.sum, which basically means any, so at least that's how I like to think about this method. So this method will loop over an array and then return true if any of them actually has true for the condition that we specify here. So if bookmark.id is the same as the ID that we just received here. Okay, let's call this here bookmark actually. And so basically what this means is that if there is any bookmark which has the bookmark ID equal to the ID that we just received, well then we want the current recipe, which is state.recipe, to be bookmarked. So bookmark equal to true. Okay, and otherwise we want it set to false. And so with this, all the recipes that we now load will always have bookmarked set to either true or false. Okay, great. And so now we actually used this state.bookmarks for anything meaningful. So up until this point, we had stored the recipe in the bookmarks array, but it wasn't really useful. So there was really no point up until now. But now here we basically use this array in order to store all the bookmarks so that when we come back to one of them, we can then mark the recipe as being bookmarked. So let's try this now again. So bookmarking this, then I come to this, and yeah, so that worked. And you see that it is bookmarked set to true. And the previous one, so the double crust stuffed pizza, is of course bookmarked set to false. And so when we click that here, it doesn't have the bookmark. Now we bookmarked it, and when we come back to it, then there it is. Okay, and now just as the final piece here, when we click on this button again, we then want to unbookmark basically this recipe. So we want to remove it from the bookmarks. But right now, of course, that doesn't happen. And so what we need now is basically yet another method or function here in our model, which will simply remove a bookmark. So doing the opposite of add bookmark. So const delete bookmark. And this one will simply receive an ID because that is actually simpler. And this is actually a common pattern that you will see in programming. When we add something, we get the entire data. And when we want to delete something, we only get the ID. So this is a pretty common pattern again. So what we want to do here is to basically delete the recipe which has this ID from the bookmarks array. Right? So state.bookmarks, and then to delete something, we use the splice method. Remember? And then here we need the index where the element is actually located that we want to delete. So we will calculate the index in a second, and then how many items we want to delete, which is only one. And so this index here, we can calculate it by using our old friend, the findIndex method. So state.bookmarks, and I think we already did something very similar to this in the Bankist application. So here we are looking for the element which has the ID equal to the ID that was passed in. So there's going to be one bookmark for which this condition here is true, so where the current bookmark.id is equal to this ID. And so for this element where this condition is true, the index will be returned. And then we can take that index and delete it from the array. And then finally, let's also mark the current recipe as not a bookmark anymore. So as not bookmarked, and here as well. And here, let's say delete bookmark. Okay. And now we need to, of course, use this function somewhere. And as always, that can only be in the controller. Okay. So this control@bookmark function will be executed whenever we click on that bookmark button. And so here we now need to control what exactly should happen in that case. So when do we actually want to add a bookmark? Well, actually only when the recipe is not yet bookmarked. So let's write that. So if model.state.recipe.bookmarked, so if that's false, then do this. So add the bookmark then. But if not, and so let's now do this instead of an else, because this is more readable, then we want to delete bookmark. And again, here we pass in actually the ID like this. And that's actually it. And this is possible, remember, so it's possible that we read the bookmarked property right at the beginning, because we add that to all the recipes that are ever loaded right at the beginning, right here. Okay? And so, yeah, this should now work. Let's try avocado now for a change. So some sushi here, that looks delicious. And we got ourselves a bug. So let's go to line number 8, 98 actually. So 98. Oh, and here we are using recipe.id because we simply copied it from here. So you see that simply copying some code many times can make us run into bugs. So here, of course, we are already receiving the ID. So that's only ID. Let's go back. And let's search for avocado again. So here we have that. Let's bookmark it. Well, that didn't work. Let's see why. So probably something wrong in our controller. So let's log this here to the console just to see if this is having any effect. Let's clear this here. And it is false. And so therefore this should have worked. But somehow nothing worked. So this code here did not get executed for some reason. Oh, and actually I see what is happening. So this code actually did get executed. So this code here will mark the recipe as bookmarked. But then in the next line of code, right here, then the recipe is already bookmarked. And so then it will delete that bookmark. And so here actually we need an else. Okay. So that's the kind of sometimes difficult bugs to find, but I'm sure that with time you will also be able to find all of these bugs. So let's click on some recipe here, mark it as a bookmark. Then we go here to some other one, mark that. Then here, that is still working. And now let's click and see if it disappears. And yes, it does. Now do the same here, come back, and it is still unbookmarked. Whoa. All right. So with this, we have the core functionality of bookmarking actually already implemented. So great job once again. And now all that is missing is that we display all our bookmarks up here in this bookmarks panel. And that is a little bit more work than it might sound, and so let's leave that for our next video. So in this lecture, we will finish implementing the bookmarking functionality. And remember that basically the only thing that is still missing is that when we bookmark a recipe like this, then we want that recipe to show up here in the bookmarks panel. So right now that is still empty and we only see this friendly message here. And so let's now go fix that. So taking a look at our markup here, we can see right here. So we can see that in the bookmarks, we will actually have also the preview element. So this one here. So basically a list element with the class of preview in it, just like we had here for the search results. And so this is actually the exact same code. And so now in order to create this bookmarks view, I can actually simply go ahead and copy this one here from the results. Okay, so at least for now, by the end of this video, we will then kind of refactor all this. But for now, let me simply copy the code here and here create the bookmarks view.js. And then here, of course, it is called bookmarks view. Okay, then we also need to change the parent element, which in this case will be this unordered list called bookmarks list. Right here. And here the error message should be no bookmarks yet. Find a nice recipe and bookmark it. All right, but the rest of the code here is actually going to be the same. And so let's now go here. So this one we can close. Let's now go to the controller and include that here. And let's actually do that below this one, just because it is so similar. So results and bookmarks. Or actually, let's do it here at the end, so that results and pagination stay together. And so now all we want to do, at least for now, is that whenever a new bookmark is added, we want to render the bookmarks view with all the bookmarks. So with the array of bookmarks. So that is right here in control add bookmarks. Here let's delete all these console.logs. And as always, add some comments. So add or remove a bookmark. Then here, update recipe view. And then here actually render the bookmarks. So that is bookmarks view dot render. And see how beautiful now everything comes together, or basically fits together. So we always have this render method, and we already know that we can call it on all the views. And so that's really nice about having an architecture structure like this. So that's going to be model.state.bookmarks. And so this is also the reason why in the state we didn't only store the IDs of the bookmarks, but really we stored the entire data about the bookmarks so that we can nicely display them in this list. So a list that will look exactly like the result list here. So this should now actually already be working. So let's click this one here now, edit as a bookmark. And now when we come here, then there it is. Great. So let's try another one. and our bookmark here is still there. Now, if we add another one, then now we have 2 of them. And you can see that it also already automatically highlights the current recipe, so the one we are currently seeing. So if we now go to this one again, well, then the spicy chicken should actually be the selected one here. And so apparently we still have some kind of bug. So basically what we have to do here is that each time that we display a recipe, we should probably update this entire bookmarks panel here, so this view, so that it can then basically select or highlight here the current recipe. So let's do that in the control recipe function. And you see that this one here is getting really crowded. So let's do that here. So bookmarks view dot update, and then again model dot state dot bookmarks. Okay. So let's add this one. Okay, that worked nicely. And now this one here became the current one. But now let's go to some other one, which is not any of the bookmarks. And so now none of them you see here is selected. And so of course that makes sense because, well, this is not one of the bookmarks. But now if we click here, then this one is of course the selected one. Now we can click here as well, because again, these elements here are basically just the same as these ones. So when we click here, it loads the corresponding recipe, and here the same. So you see that now we went back to this one, and this one got selected correctly, this one got selected correctly as well, and we also got the correct recipe. And that's just amazing. So you see how easy it is now to integrate a new feature like this bookmark feature when we already have a very nice architecture and structure in our code. Imagine that we had all of this code here simply in one huge messy file. Then how difficult would it be to keep track of all the data and of how these different functions all interact with one another? Now, just to finish, we need to fix the fact that these 2 views here are essentially the same. So at least the markup that they generate is in fact exactly the same. And so that is of course not good. So what I will do now is to basically implement a view that is kind of a parent view of these 2 views. And that will be called the preview view. So because this element here is called preview. And so then that can contain all of these methods here. And then in the generate markup of these 2, we will then use those 2. So, but instead of explaining it, let me actually show it. So that's preview view.js. And now let me get all of this here. All right. So this will now be called preview view. And what this view will do is to basically only generate one preview element like this here. All right. So this one will not have any message. It will not have an error message. And the parent element is also not important. So just follow me here for now, and I will explain why that is. So here I will simply select everything. Or in fact, I could simply set this here to an empty string. So we don't need any parent element here. And actually this here is only the generate markup. And here we don't need any of this. Okay, so again, this preview view will only generate the markup for one of these preview elements. All right. And so now let's come here to the bookmarks view and get rid of this method here so that we don't need anymore. And now here comes the magic. So as I mentioned before, we will use the preview view kind of as a child view of the bookmarks view and of the results view. So let's import the preview view here. So import preview view from .js. And now what we will do here is to still loop over this .data, which is still all of the bookmarks. But now what we want to do here is to call basically this generate markup. However, that would not really work. And so what we really want is this. So result, and then for each of them, we want preview.render actually. So with the result. But actually that is not all yet, because like this wouldn't work. But let's quickly analyze what is going to happen here. So with these three here. So as the render method on bookmarks view is called, so this render method, it will set the data on the bookmarks view, and then it will generate the markup. So it will call this method here. And so this gets access to this .data, and then we map over that data. And so for each of the results, or let's actually call it bookmarks here. So bookmark. So for each of this bookmark, so not bookmark. So for each of the bookmarks, we want to then render a preview. However, here we actually need to return a string. So all of this should be a string that we need to return from the generate markup method, so that then in the view, it can insert that markup into the DOM, right? However, by having render here, preview.js itself will try to render some markup. And so that is not really going to work. And so what we will do is to change our render method here and add a second parameter to it. So here we will add a parameter called render, which by default will be set to true. So then all of this here stays the same, but if render is false, which is what we will set it to in a minute, so if render is false, then we actually want to return this markup that was just generated. Now, why don't we simply call generate markup itself without messing with the whole render method? So here, why don't we simply call preview view.generate markup? Well, that's because we still needed to set the data property to the data that we passed in. So that then here in the preview view, we can use did_this keyword. And so actually we need to now replace result by this.data. So this.data and then all of that. Okay. And so here we want to render it and set the render parameter to false. Okay, so that was a lot to take in. So let's recap what happens here. So the first part I think is obvious. So what happens when bookmarks view.render is called? So we then enter this method here. Now, since we didn't duplicate the same code here of preview view, so basically this way here of generating this preview, we essentially separated that into its own child view. And so then here in the bookmarks view, we try to render basically that view for each of the bookmarks. But instead of actually rendering it to the DOM, we simply have the render method return the markup as a string. So that's why we set it here to false, which will then trigger this code here, right? And so then all of this here will basically become a string. And so in the end, we end up with an array of strings. So because of map. And then in the end, we join all of that together and end up with a big string with all the markup that we want to render. So let's see what happens here. So as we click, let's see the console here. And it looks like we didn't get any error. And so indeed, now here our bookmarks still work. Now the search here will not yet work because we still need to put this here in the results view. But that's very easy. All we have to do now is to copy this code and put it here. And here we can now call this result, but of course it would have worked exactly the same way. And we also need to import the preview view. But that should be it. And so now these two views are essentially the same thing, with the only difference that they have a different parent element and a different error message, right? But the main functionality of them, so the main way of generating the markup, is essentially the same for them. And so in order to encapsulate that somewhere, we created another child class. And so that is, again, this one here. Okay, so please analyze this here after this video is done and really take a look at how the data flows between these different modules and between these different classes. All right, so let's see. And indeed, it still works. So here for now we get our message because we don't have any bookmarks yet. But as we click it, then that should appear there. Let's add another one. And beautiful. So that works great. Here we can then come back to the next one. And now let's unbookmark it. So it should disappear now. And now unbookmark this one as well. And then we get automatically this message here. So the no bookmarks yet message, which of course automatically comes here from this error message that we specified in this bookmarks view. So that's really great. So our application is becoming almost finished, actually. And now all that we want to do here to finish the bookmarks is to actually persist it between page loads. So right now, of course, this one here is bookmarked. But now as we reload the page, then that bookmark is gone, right? So it's no longer here, and it's also no longer up here. And so now what we're going to do next is to store our bookmarks data into the local storage. And then as we load the page, we basically get that data back. So as I mentioned by the end of the last lecture, in this one, we will now make the bookmarks data persist across page loads. And for that, we're going to use local storage. And once again, this will now become quite easy and quite straightforward because we already have our entire project structure so nicely set up. So storing data in local storage is of course all about data. And so that will have to be implemented here in the model. So let's actually take a look here at our flowchart again. And so now this is all about loading bookmarks from local storage and storing bookmarks to local storage. So when should the bookmarks be stored to local storage? Well, that happens whenever the user bookmarks a recipe. And of course, also when the user unbookmarks the recipe. So in either of these cases, the current bookmarks array basically needs to be stored to local storage. Okay, so what I just said is that whenever we add a bookmark or delete a bookmark, we need to persist that data. And so let's add a function here, which we can then call in these two functions. So this one we don't need to export because we simply will call it in these other two functions. So persist bookmarks. And then here, remember, all we have to do is local storage dot set item. Then here we can give that item a name. So that's bookmarks. And then here we need to set a string. And we do that by calling json.stringify and then with the object that we basically want to convert to a string. And so that is state.bookmarks. And that's actually it. Now all we have to do is to call this function in these two places. And that's already the first step, and we can actually try that out already. So at least seeing it in the console. So let's bookmark this one and also this Greek pasta salad. Right? So both of them are now here. And let's come here to application and then local storage. And so here it is already. So here are the bookmarks with these two recipes that we just stored. And now as I reload the page, you see that the data is still here. Now, of course, it is not yet back here. So just because the data is still in local storage doesn't mean that it's magically gonna show up here, because we didn't write any code for that yet. But let's now actually go do that. So basically, when the page is loaded, we then want to run a method which will basically render the bookmarks here. All right. So the first step in doing that is to actually get the bookmarks out of the local storage and back into our code. And then after that, we can then, as I just said, render them back here to this bookmarks view. Okay. So we have the code for persisting, so for storing the bookmarks in local storage here. So let's now also have the code for taking them out also right here. And let me simply write an initialization function here. So an init function, and then right at the beginning, I will call that init function. And here, of course, missing the function keyword. And so here we need to do the opposite. So local storage dot get item, and then remember it is called bookmarks. And then we also need to store that somewhere. And I'm not storing it directly into our state because this data might not be defined actually. So we might have nothing, of course, in the storage. And so only if there is storage, then we want state.bookmarks to be json.parse, which is basically to convert the string back to an object. And so here we are now calling this function right in the beginning. And then just to see, let's then immediately log state.bookmarks to the console. Okay, so here we have a lot of logs. So let's go here to line 11 of these two and line 114 of the model. So model, now this one actually is the one that I just did, but here we apparently have some console.logs that we don't need. So here and here. And in fact, let's close these here. And actually all of them for now. And so here, right immediately, we have the local storage. Now, for some reason, this recipe was not found. Let's reload. Well, that's weird. And apparently, we broke something in our code. But let's worry about that in a second. So for now, what matters here is that we actually got the data back from local storage. So let's see if this has anything to do with the code that we just wrote here. Well, that's very weird. So now it is back to working for some reason. So let's actually log the error that is actually happening to the console. So here, let's set that back to cause that error. But then here in the controller, so the one that is responsible for loading the recipe. So here right now, we are only rendering the error to the user interface. And we are doing that with this nicely formatted error that we defined in the recipe view. But so let's now actually also log the error itself in the console so that we can see what is actually happening. So console.error with error. And so now we get text content of undefined coming from controller at line 34. Okay, that's just the log. And so here we have the stack trace. And so the error itself is originating in line 25. So it is here when we update the bookmarks view. Okay, so this is where the error basically comes from. And so this is how we use this so-called stack trace. So here we can then follow exactly what happens. So here we then need to go to view 27, which is where this update is defined, then for each, and then line 37. So line 37 in the view. And so that is right here. So some kind of problem with updating the bookmarks view. So apparently we're trying to set the text content on some element here that doesn't yet exist. So maybe we are simply calling this method here a little bit too soon. So let's move that here to the end. So updating bookmarks view. So we still have an error. So this might be a good time to use the debugger. And I hope that with this, we will be able to find the bug. And if you're not interested in watching me find this bug, then please feel free to jump to some later point in the code. So you see that at this point, the recipe has actually loaded. Okay. And so now here we are at the debugger. And so let's now go to the next step, which is this one here. Then we go into bookmarks view.update. And at this point, the data here is actually already the data that is coming from our local storage, right? So this bookmarks here is at this point already loaded. So right here, we do that right at the beginning. And so therefore, the bookmarks, so model.state.bookmarks, here is already defined. So that's these two objects right there. Let's actually see the scope here. And so indeed, that's these two recipe objects, right? So here we also have the entire call stack. Okay. And now let's keep going. So the new markup, then here we go through all of this. Okay. Once again. All right. So here we are back. Whoa, what's that? So I just hovered over the string, which is all of this. So that's this markup that we just generated. Then here, let's generate this DOM. Okay. Then here, the new elements and the current elements. So right now, here inside the current elements, let's see what that is. So that's all of the elements that are basically right now in that empty bookmarks panel, right? Now, and you see that the length of this one here is 5, and this one here is 14. And so I think I'm starting to see the problem here. So these two arrays are the arrays that we are basically comparing here, right? So we have this whole for each loop to compare the elements in these two arrays, right? Because the goal of this method is to not add new elements, but only to replace some text in elements that already exists. However, right now this bookmarks here is still empty, and what this update here is trying to do is to now insert the data in there. And so that should not happen. Okay? And so I'll actually quit this now by going back here, getting rid of this, and simply reloading. So let's get this down. And so in order to prevent this, the first thing that we need to do now on the page is basically render the bookmarks. And remember, that should happen right at the beginning when we load the page. So let's go to the bookmarks view and here create a new handler. So add handler render, which receives an handler, and then window.add event listener and load. And then we will immediately call this handler. Okay. And so here we already imported it. And so here at the very end, let's create then the handler function. So the controller control bookmarks. And then all that we will do is actually take bookmarks view dot render with state dot bookmarks. And again, that is actually model dot state. And now let's, as the first of all thing here, do bookmarks view dot add handler render with the control bookmarks. And so now we are back to working, and the two bookmarks from before are now actually here. All right, so with that we solved the problem. Because now, as the page here tries to then updating the bookmarks view, the bookmarks are already there. And so then there's nothing to update really. So we can actually move that back up here, I believe. Actually, this one as well. So let's try that again. And yeah, so this is a bit of a more natural order. Okay. And so now, of course, I can click here, and then this gets selected, and everything keeps working the same. So we don't even need to search functionality to be able to switch between our recipes. And of course, if we unbookmark, then that is gone. And as we reload the page, then we only have this one. Then let's remove all of them. And then as this was re-rendered, right, then we got this error message here back. And of course, if we reload now, then we have no bookmarks at all again. Now, just to finish, let's quickly add like a quick function here for debugging. So let's call it clear bookmarks. which is simply a function that at some point we might want to call, but again, only during development. So clear, then bookmarks. So when I'm working with this, then sometimes I need to do this. So clearing all the bookmarks. So let me add a couple of ones here. So this one and this one. Okay, and now as I reload the page, it should then clear all of them. Well, it didn't for some reason. Oh, and that's probably because this one here happened first. So let's take this one out, do that again, and now the bookmarks are gone. Okay, but by default, this will of course be turned off because otherwise our application is not going to work. So here is the hot pizza dip, and it is still bookmarked after we reload the application. And so let's quickly to finish check out our flowchart, but I'm pretty confident that everything is implemented. So when the user clicks a bookmark, it will then mark the selected bookmark here, and of course it will render the recipe. When the page loads, then the bookmarks are loaded from local storage and they are rendered. So check here as well. And when the user bookmarks a recipe, then it gets stored to local storage. So check here as well. And so we just implemented all of this, a rather complex part. So now it's finally time to take a break and take an overview of what we need to implement next in order to finish this application. So after a couple of very long videos, let's now take a breath and take a minute to discuss our next step in implementing this project. So at this point, we have implemented all the features from 1 to 7, and now all that is left to do is steps 8, 9, and 10, which are all about the user being able to upload their own recipes. So whenever the user clicks the Add Recipe button that's in the menu bar, all we want to do is to display a recipe editor. So that's like a model window which will pop up and which contains a form. Then on that form, we will have to bind an event handler so that when the user submits that form, so here in this diagram, that means when the user creates a new recipe, then of course we want to asynchronously upload that recipe to the API, and we will also want to render that recipe and also add it to the user's bookmarks. And so that is feature number 9 here in our feature lists. So basically that all our own recipes are automatically bookmarked. Finally, all this is going to be set up in a way that only the user that uploaded the recipe will be able to see that recipe. So for example, if I upload my own pizza recipe, then if you search for pizza afterwards, you will not be able to see that recipe. So these recipes are really going to belong to you. And as I mentioned before, we will do that by using an API developer key. So these are the last steps that we need to take in order to finish our application. And so let's start by doing that in the next lecture, starting with the simple functionality of displaying the window when the user clicks Add Recipe. So, as I just said, let's now start with the feature of uploading a new recipe and start with the ability of opening the model window which contains the form to add the new recipe. So in the demo version, this is what it looks like. So here we click Add Recipe and then it opens up this form like this. And then when we click this button or click outside of the form, then that window will again close. All right, so let's do that and let's create a new bookmarks view. And actually not a bookmarks view, but a add recipe view.js. And now let's go to one of these views and copy the code from there, because this code is always very similar. So let's delete this one here. Let's empty out this method. And then here, let's call it add recipe view. Now, this view here is actually going to be quite different from the other views, because we already have actually the view in the HTML. So if we come here to our HTML code, then you see that the form that we want to display is actually already here in the code. All right. So here we have this element for the overlay and this element for the window, and they both have the hidden class. And so showing the window and the overlay is going to be as simple as removing this hidden class from both these elements. Now, the main element that we are actually really interested in is this upload element. And so let's actually make this upload element the parent element of the add recipe view. So upload here, but then we will also have to select some other elements. So for example, the window and the overlay. So to start at least. So the window element is going to be document.querySelector. And then let's see what we have here. Here we can close all of these for now. So that's add recipe window. And then the overlay has simply the overlay class. And so here, overlay, and here as well. And here we are missing the dot on both selectors. And now we also need to select the button that will be clicked to open the window, and also the button to close the window. So that button is somewhere here in the top navigation bar. So this is for the bookmarks. And here it is. So this is the button for adding the recipe, as you see. So let's call that the button open. And then also the button to close the form. And so that's back here somewhere in the window. So that's button close modal. Okay. And here. Okay. And so now let's listen for the events. So of clicking the open button and the close button. Okay. And as always, we will do that in a method called addHandler and then something, just to make it more consistent. So addHandler show window, let's say. And so here we will want to select the button. So button open dot add event listener of a click. And so when that happens, what do we want to do? Well, we want to take the overlay and the window and remove the hidden class. So that's this dot overlay dot class list dot remove. Now, instead of remove, we can actually also use toggle. So remember that toggle will add the class if it's not there, and it will remove the class when it is already there. And so this will make it a lot easier to then reuse this class. So the overlay and also the window. Okay. Now, when do we actually want this function here to be called? Well, we want this to be called as soon as the page loads. Now, in this case, this has nothing to do with any controller, because there's nothing special happening here that the controller needs to tell us, right? So when this click happens on the button open, all that will happen is really for the window to show. So the controller doesn't need to interfere in any of this. And so therefore, we can simply run this function here as soon as this object is created. And so what I'm going to do is to this time add a constructor method. Then since this is a child class, we need to start by calling super. And so only after that we can use the this keyword. And then let's say this dot add handler show window. And so this one here is now only going to be used inside of this class. And so let's add an underscore to mark it as protected. And so again, in order to show this window, the controller does not interfere at all. All right. Now, what we will have to do in the controller still is to import this object here, because otherwise our main script, so the controller, will never execute this file. And so then this object here will never be created. And so the event listener here would then never be added. And so we need to, again, import this so that the code that is in the module is actually being run. So here, let's call that the add recipe view. And now let's check out our code just to make sure we reload it. And we get a class list of undefined. So some small bug here. And again, you see how common that is. So let's again see which line that actually was. So line 19. So with the overlay. So let's see if the class is correct. Well, it looks so. Oh, but I can see the error now. So here we are using the this keyword inside of a handler, right? But you already know that the this keyword inside of a handler function points to the element on which that listener is attached to. So in this case, that is this button here. And so let's actually export this entire function into another method and then call that method with the correct this keyword bound to it. So here is what I mean. Toggle window, let's say, will do this. And then here we want to call this dot toggle window. And now here we can use our bind method as always, and then bind the correct this keyword. So we have done this many times before. So basically manually setting the this keyword inside of this function here now to the this keyword that we actually want it to be. And so right here, this of course points to the current object, because otherwise, again, the this keyword inside of this function would be the button on which the event listener is attached to. And so with this, it should now work. And yeah, there is our form. And now all we have to do is to close that form when we click this button or click outside here. So add handler hide window. And so that's actually very similar to this one. Let's just duplicate it actually. So button close. And then the same also on the overlay. And so that's why this toggle here is now very useful. Because here at this point, when we want to hide the window, then the hidden class is no longer there, but it will then automatically add it back on. Oh, and before we actually try it, we first, of course, need to call this method here as well. Okay, and it's gone. Great. So that works. And so next up, let's take care of handling this button here. And for now, what we want to do when we click this button is to get all the data here out of this form. And you see that I already have like pre-filled this data here. And so that comes from the HTML here because the value is basically already set. But then of course, by the end, we will remove this. So this is just for development purposes. But anyway, let's now create another method here, which is going to handle the click on that button. So basically the form submission. So add handler upload. And so here we will now actually listen for an event right on the parent element. So that is the upload form itself. So parent element dot add event listener for submit. And then in our function, as always, the first thing is to prevent default. So here we need access to the event prevent default. And now, how do we get access to all of these values? Well, we could go ahead and select all of these form elements one by one and then read the value property of all of them. However, there's actually an easier way because we can use something called form data. So that's a pretty modern browser API that we can now make use of. So let's say data equals, and then we can create a new form data. And into the form data constructor, we have to pass in an element that is a form. And so that form, in this case, is the this keyword, right? Because we are inside of a handler function, and so this points to this.parent element, which is, of course, the upload form. Now this here will then return a weird object that we cannot really use, but we can actually spread that object into an array, like this. All right, and so this will then basically give us an array which contains all the fields with all the values in there. So let's then log that data to the console. Now let's think what we actually want to do with this data eventually. So this data right here is the data that we eventually will want to use to upload to the API, right? And that action of uploading the data is going to be just another API call, right? And where do API calls happen? Well, they happen in the model. And so therefore, we will need a way of getting this data to the model. So just like we did many times before, we now need to create a controller function, which will then be the handler of this event. Okay, so let's come down here and create control add recipe. And so this function here will then actually receive the new recipe data. And let's actually have this one here log the data to the console. So new recipe. Okay, and now all we have to do is to say add recipe view dot add handler upload, and then control add the recipe. So this is the publisher subscriber pattern that we have used many times before. And so eventually here we will have some function to then upload the new recipe data. Okay, and so here we now need to accept this handler function, and then we need to call it. So instead of logging it to the console right here, we will simply call the handler function, and so this handler function will then, for now, log it to the console. Because, again, that handler is now this control add recipe. All right, so let's see what happens. And so that's why I have all of these pre-filled data now, so that we can simply click the upload button and then get our data down here immediately. So let's now take a look at that data. And so since we got that data, it means that everything is correctly set up, which is great. And so here we get the array of multiple arrays in there. So basically the entries of this form, where the first element is always the name of the field, and the second one is the value. All right. So title, source URL, and you see all of them here. Okay. Now, usually our recipe data is always an object and not an array of entries like this. And so in JavaScript, since ES 2019, there's now a new and very handy method that we can use to convert entries to an object. So let's actually call this one here data array. And then the data itself is going to be object dot from entries, and then the data array. And so this from entries method here is basically the opposite of the entries method that is available on arrays, right? So this one takes an array of entries and converts it to an object. So let's see what that looks like in practice. And beautiful. So this looks already a lot more like our original recipe object, like this one here, for example. It is, of course, still missing some formatting, and it is still missing some data like the ID, but that we will take care of in the model. And so let's go do that in the next video. Let's now continue working on the recipe uploading feature. And this time we will actually work on the model which will be responsible for sending the recipe data to the Forkify API. So let's go to our model, and then down here after the bookmarks, let's create a new function and export it called upload recipe. Okay, and this one will eventually make a request to the API, and so therefore it's going to be an async function, and it will receive the data for a new recipe. Now the first task of this function here will be to take the raw input data and transform it into the same format as the data that we also get out of the API. So let's take a look at that. And now it reloaded the page, of course. So basically the format of the data that we receive from the API looks a little bit like this. Now it has some different property names here, but what really matters here is that the ingredients are nicely stored in this array. So there is an ingredients array which contains a bunch of objects where each contains quantity, unit, and description. However, the data that we get into the function right now simply has these three, or actually these six ingredient properties. So ingredient 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And also it has each of these ingredients here separated with these commas all in one string. And so now we need to basically put all of this data here into one array and also separate each of these strings into the quantity, unit, and description. Now, of course, here in the form, I could have also created 3 different fields for each ingredient. So one input field for the quantity, the unit, and the description. But that was a little bit too much work for this learning project. And so I decided that I will simply give this hint that the format needs to be quantity, comma, unit, comma, description. And so that's what we have here. So half a kilo, so kilo is the unit, and then rice is the description. Then here we need 1 avocado, but there is no unit, and so we leave that one empty. And then here we have just salt. So without any quantity and any unit. And so let's now take this data, so these 6 ingredients, and then take the data out of there and put them into an object. So this is how we will do it. So we want to create an array of ingredients. And so for that, a good idea is to use the map method, right? So map is always good to create new arrays based on some existing data. So in order to use map, we need an array. And so let's convert the object that we get here back to an array. So object.entries. And as I mentioned, this is basically the opposite of object.fromEntries. But it still makes sense to convert it to an object here, because we will also need the rest of the data here as an object. So new recipe, and then we want to filter this array, because remember, we only want the properties that are called ingredient 1, 2, 3, all the way until 6. So in this array that we have right now, each element is an entry, right? And once again, let me actually show that to you. So without seeing the data, I think that it becomes very difficult to follow this. So I will console.log this data here. And now, of course, we need to call this function upload recipe in the controller. So let's not do this, but let's actually call model.upload recipe with the new recipe. Okay, let's click here. And so again, that is our array that we will work with now. And so remember, right now we are filtering this array. And so what we want is basically only the entries where the first element of the array starts with ingredient, like this, right? And then also the second part should not be empty. So in this case, we are of course not interested in 4, 5, 6. Okay, so here in this condition that we need for the filter, we want to say, just as I explained just a second ago, so the first element of the current entry should start with ingredient, and the second one should exist. So it should not be an empty string. So entry 1, so the second element, should not be an empty string. Okay, and so this should now filter out only the data that we are interested in. So let's log that to the console and not this anymore. And yeah, so that is what we were looking for. And now all we need to do is to basically take the data out of the string here and then put that into an object. And so for that, we now finally use the map method. And so here we already have some ingredients. And so now we will take each ingredient and split it by the comma. So that's the separator that I specified. And before we do that, let's actually make sure that we remove any white space here. So we can simply do .replace. And I believe that right now the replace all method is actually already available. So remember in the video where we talked about strings, I mentioned that replace all will soon be available in browsers. And I believe that right now it already is. And so let's use that here. So let's replace all the basically spaces with an empty string. And so this should then return an array of 3 elements. And so let's now destruct that array. So the first element is the quantity, the second one is the unit, and the third one is the description. And now let's return an object with this. So with quantity, unit, and description. Now we will still have to do some things here, but for now let's take a look at what we get. And ingredient.replaceAll is not a function. So now that's because each ingredient here is actually still an array. So just like we had it here before in the entry. So the first element of entry here, remember, was the key, and the second one was the value itself. So here we need to use this on ingredient 1. So the second element of the entry. So let's see now. And here we go. So we have quantity, unit, and description nicely inside of one array. And so that now kind of looks like this. Great. Now there's just one thing that we need to notice here, which is that when the quantity does not exist, then we want it to be null. And otherwise, it's actually a number. So currently we still have strings here, but we want this to be a number now. And so let's go ahead and convert that. So let's come here. So the quantity should be, so if there is a quantity, so let's use the ternary operator. So if there is a quantity, then convert that to a number. All right, and if not, which is the situation in which it is an empty string, then we want to return null. So that should fix that. And indeed, it does. But now let's see what happens when we simply put something else here. Let's say just a number. So let's see. Well, then here we get a bunch of undefineds. And so that we don't want. So our format here should always contain quantity, comma, unit, comma, description. So in this case, what we would need to do is this. So this is what we would expect. And so then we get here the empty strings as expected. So basically what this means is that when we split this string here, we want it to have 3 parts. All right. And so let's actually convert that to our code. So here we want to now put this here into a separate variable. So let's call it ingredients array. And then that is the array that we destructure. But before we do that, we can test if this array actually has the length of 3. So if ing array.length is different from 3, then we want to create a new error. So throw new error, and then let's say wrong ingredient format. Please use the correct format. And so then at this point here, the function will immediately exit. Now, then what do we want to actually happen with this error? Well, we will want to render an error message to this view. So to the add recipe view, right? And that is very simple. So here we can use or try catch just like we have been doing before. So try. And so if some error occurs in this function here, then it goes to the catch block as always. So here we get the error. And then let's log that error to the console. Again, with some emojis here to make it easy to understand that it is our own error. And then we can simply say add recipe view dot render error. And now we can actually pass in the error message ourselves. because here in the view, we accounted for that ability. So by default, the error message is coming from this.error message, but we can also specify our own. And so that is what we will do now, because this way we are able to create the error message basically here where the error actually occurred. Okay, so error.message. And so now let's see what happens. So for now, let's use the correct format just to see if everything keeps working. And it does. But now let's do it wrong. And we get wrong ingredient format, but it is still coming from the model. So here we get uncaught in promise. And that actually makes sense because remember that here we are in an async function already. So this returns a promise. And so basically this then rejects the promise. And so therefore we should handle that already right here. So try like this. And then catch the error and simply throw that error again. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, and that still doesn't look the way we want it to look. So we want it here to be an error message. And so that should come from the controller. And so that means that there is something wrong in the controller. And I guess I know why that happens, because remember that this is an async function right here. So it returns a promise, but then right here, we are actually not awaiting that promise. So we need to use await here and then also make this an async function. And so only with this, we are now actually handling this function here as a function that returns a promise so that the rejected promise can then actually get caught here in this catch block. So let's try once again here with some number. And now it works. So now we get the actual error with this emoji mark and also the error that we want here. Okay, great. So we have that part working of the ingredients. Now it's time to actually create the object that is ready to be uploaded. So let's create a recipe object here. And so basically this object will be the opposite of this one here. So here we take in like the source URL formatted as this, and we want to send the data where the URL looks like this. So where the property has this format. It's the same here for the URL and the cooking time actually, because that is exactly the format that the API is ready to receive. So it has to be exactly the way that we received it. Okay, so let's write that object very quick. So that is at new recipe.title. Then the source URL is at new recipe.source URL like this. Then the image URL is new recipe.image, right? Then the publisher is actually the same. .publisher. The cooking time, new recipe.cooking time. So fortunately, VS Code is giving us already the correct suggestions. .servings. And so that's all, I think. And so all we have to do now is to add the ingredients array. And that's it. And then we also have two numbers here, which we should convert to numbers using this plus trick. All right. And so now let's actually log this one to the console and not just the ingredients. Oh, and of course, all this should be happening inside of this try block, right? So let's see. Okay, that looks great, and it looks ready to be actually sent to our API. Okay, so let's do that. So remember, we already have a method for getting JSON. So that's this one. And now let's create a method for sending JSON here in our helper. And actually, it's going to be very similar. So for now, let's just copy it. But then a bit later, we will simply refactor this. So here, let's call it send JSON. All right. And so now let's learn how we can actually send data using the fetch function. So up until this point, all we ever did was to simply pass in a URL into the fetch function, and that would then automatically create a GET request. However, to send data, remember how we discussed before that needs to be a POST request. And so here, besides passing in the URL, we also need to pass in an object of some options. Okay, and the first option is going to be the method. And so that method is now post. Then we also need to pass in an object of headers. And headers are basically some snippets of text which are like information about the request itself. And many of them are like standard headers. And one that we need to define is the content type. So content type with an uppercase C and a T. So make sure you get that right. And then here, application /JSON. And so with this, we tell the API, so we specify in the request that the data that we're going to send is going to be in the JSON format. And so only then our API can correctly accept that data and create a new recipe in the database. And now finally, the payload of the request. So basically the data that we want to send, which is called the body. So the body should be in JSON, remember, as I just explained. And so we can once again use json.stringify and then convert the data that we want to send. Now, and here we actually need to accept that data here into the function, of course, as a second parameter. So let's call that upload data. And so that is the data that we then convert to JSON so that it can be sent. And that's actually it. So that's all we need to do. So we still pass in a URL, which we will need to specify next. And then we take that URL and the upload data and then simply create this fetch request like this. Okay? And then everything else is actually going to be the same. So we will still have this request racing about a timeout function so that it can't run forever. And we will also await any data coming back because this API that we're going to use, so the Forkify API, will actually return the data back that we just sent. And you will see in a moment why that is very important. Okay? So again, everything here is going to be the same. And so a bit later, we will then refactor these two here into the same function. But let's do that later. So here we now need to import the send JSON function. And so now let's use our newly created function to create the AJAX request. So send JSON, and now the URL of the API. And actually, we have that here stored somewhere. So that's this URL that we have in the config, right? So /recipes, but that's actually not all, as we will see in a second. All right, let's get rid of this. And now let's go to the Forkify documentation page. So at this URL, because now we actually need the API key. So please click here now on this button which will then generate your unique developer key. Now, if you got some kind of error here while generating your key, then maybe it is because you requested more than one API keys per hour. So remember that you should only ever request one API key. That's why I have this limit here in place, so that no one can abuse my API, basically. Now, if you did actually only try it once and you still got an error, then you can always contact me on Twitter. Okay, so here's the link to my Twitter page, and then just tweet the error at me, and I will try to help you. Now my key disappeared here, so let's click here again. And now I will copy it so that I can use it in my code. So let's go down here, or actually it's right here. So you see the API path is actually exactly the same as for getting all the recipes. Now the only difference is that, of course, we will not search for anything now, but we will have to add our key like this. So with this key parameter. Okay, and so yeah, we are doing a post request now, right? And so that creates a new recipe then when we hit this endpoint, so this path with a post request and some data. Okay, now let's store actually this key in the config file. So as a string. Okay, and then let's use that key here. So again, the question mark to specify a list of parameters, and then key equals, and then we have to import it up here. And then the key. Okay, and remember that this will actually send the recipe then back to us. And so let's store that as data and also await it. And then finally, let's log that data to the console. So console.log data. And now let's see what happens. So we got a lot of errors here. So it seems like the data is completely wrong. And that's simply because I just forgot to actually put that data here. So the recipe. So of course, send.json has two parameters. So not only the URL, but also the data. Let's try that again. And it kind of worked already, because this error that we got back here is actually already an error coming from our API. So it tells us that the input data is invalid because the source URL needs to be at least 5 characters long. So let's try that again. Oh, and actually we need to reload for now. So the URL, let's just add something here, and probably all of them need this. So let's do that quickly here in the HTML, so as the default value, kind of. So you see now we have test 23, and as we upload it now, then that worked. So we get a status success back from our server and then our data, right? So that data contains everything that we just sent it, plus the created ad and also an ID, and of course, also your key. And that key will be very important in the next video when we then want to mark our own recipes, basically as our own. Now, it will make sense to actually render this newly created recipe also then to the user interface after closing this display here. So after closing this window, right? And so therefore, we need to convert that to the format that we use in our application, right? So basically, in our application, we are using these different like property names, right? So we are in the same situation as we are here in load recipe, where we get the data in the original format, so with this kind of property names, and we now need to convert it back to this one so that our application understands the data. All right, now instead of writing this entire code here twice, we can simply grab this and put it into a new function. So let's do that right here and call that one create recipe object, and it simply receives some data, and then it returns an object like this. So return this, so that then we can do whatever we want with it. And in this case, that's going to be to put that in the state. So state.recipe will be create recipe object with the data that we receive. So basically just some nice refactoring. So this now does exactly what we had before, but now we can use that down here as well. So we get the data, and now we want to then store that into the state. So again, state.recipe equals create recipe object with the data that we just received. And now let's actually come here to the controller and log that state.recipe to the console. So that's model.state.recipe. Okay. So let's see. And yeah, it now looks exactly the same as this one. Right? So beautiful. There's just one thing missing, which is this bookmarked here, and also the key is missing as well. So let's take care of the bookmarking and also of preserving our API key in this object. Okay, and a quick look at our flowchart here will reveal that all we want to do is basically store the bookmarks to local storage, right? And also mark, of course, that recipe as a bookmark. Okay, so we already implemented most of this. So this and this in the last lecture, then this part and this part in this lecture. But let's now also take care of bookmarking it. But that is very easy because we already have the function for that. So that is, of course, add bookmark. So we already have our recipe, and so we can simply call add bookmark with our recipe, and that will then take care of everything. So add bookmark with state.recipe. And finally, we also need to add our key to the object, so to state.recipe. And we could do that here manually, but let's actually use a nice trick to do that down here or up here where the object is actually created. So right here. Now, in the case of a load recipe, not always there will be a key. So most of the recipes, of course, don't have any key. And so we cannot simply do this. So key recipe dot key, because again, not all of them will have one. So we only want to add the key if there actually exists one. So let's use a nice trick to do that. So we can use the AND operator, which does short circuiting. So we can do recipe dot key and then this object. All right. And I will explain to you in a second what this does. And then we can spread this. So that looks confusing. So let me explain what is happening here. So remember that the AND operator short circuits. So if recipe.key is a falsy value, so if it doesn't exist, well then nothing happens here, right? And so then the destructuring here, well, does basically nothing. Now, if this actually is some value, then the second part of the operator is executed and returned. And so in that case, it is this object here basically that is going to be returned. And so then this whole expression will become that object. And so then we can spread that object to basically put the values here. And so that will then be the same as if the values would be out here like this. Key recipe.key. But again, only in case that the key actually does exist. And so this is a very nice trick to conditionally add properties to an object. So keep this one in mind. It is a very handy trick sometimes. Okay, and I think we should actually be done here now. So you see, uploading data is a lot of work. But I think this is still a nice exercise. And let's see, here is our key now. And also the recipe is now bookmarked. Great. So just to finish this lecture very quickly, let's go back to the controller and now actually render this recipe in the recipe view. So render recipe, which will be recipe view dot render, and then as always model.state dot recipe. But now with this we would not really be able to see that rendered recipe yet because we still have that form open. So let's now close that form. So close form window, and we can do that because there is already a method for that here. So it's this public toggle window method. And so let's now use that. Okay. So, and actually let's not do that immediately, but only after some time so that we can first display a nice success message. So we can use a set timeout. And then inside of that callback function, we can then call add recipe view dot toggle window. And here let's specify some time, let's say 2.5 seconds. However, as you already know, we should never use a magic number like this. So let's create one more configuration variable here. Let's call this the modal close, and then let's say seconds, so that we know that this value is actually a value in seconds. So let's use 2.5. And now we need to actually import this, because I believe that right now we are not yet importing this into the controller. And indeed, we're not. So let's say then the named import from config.js. And so then down here, let's use that modal close seconds and then times 1,000 to convert it to milliseconds. Okay, and before we do that, let's also display a success message. And for that, we already have in our view the render message method, right? Which will take this .message, which in this case, we don't have one yet, but let's actually add one. Recipe was successfully uploaded. And so now it's very, very easy to do this. All we have to do is add recipe view dot render message. And so once again, now that we have all of these nice methods in place, it's very easy to take data and then render all kinds of things on the user interface. For example, like this error or the success message, or of course, the data itself. So let's try one more time. And there is our success message, and it also disappeared. And great, here is our recipe. And also with our nicely formatted ingredients. So remember, we put 0.5 kilos of rice, and so of course that was successfully converted to 1/2. And you see it's also already a bookmark. So you see that it's right here. Of course, there's no image because that path that I specified there is of course not a correct path, but that doesn't matter at all here. And now to really finish, let's now add just one final thing, which is to render like a loading spinner in the add recipe view before we actually start to upload the data. So this will then show the user that something is happening. And so one more time, that is now really easy to do because we already have all these methods in place. Okay, let's slow down our network a little bit to slow 3G so that we can actually see it happening. Well, that didn't display the spinner for some reason there. So let's see. Add recipe view dot render spinner looks pretty correct to me. So let's just take out this piece here so that we can actually inspect the code. Oh, and now it's taking more time because we are. So let's put it back online. Add a recipe. Oh, and now you see it actually showed the loading spinner. So not sure what happened there, but now it is all good. Okay, great. So all we have left to do now is to then display this recipe as our own, basically by using the key that we have now here in our object, and also do the same thing in the search. So let's take maybe a quick break and then come back to finally finish this application. All right, so this is the third and final part of implementing the functionality of uploading our recipes. And let's start by adding yet another recipe so that I can show you something that is still missing from our controller. So actually, two things. So let's say this one here, test avocado. Okay, just so we have a different name. And watch what happens here to the URL as we upload this recipe. So actually nothing will change. So take a look at that. Okay, so recipe was successfully uploaded. And we also still need to remove this window, right? But anyway, here is the recipe that we just uploaded, but the URL did not change. And also, it did not yet add this new recipe to our bookmarks. Okay, so of course it is bookmarked, right, as you see here, and as you can also see down here. But we didn't yet re-render this bookmarks panel, right? So there are two things that we need to fix. So we need to re-render this bookmarks view, and we also need to change the ID here in the URL. Because watch what happens if I reload this page now. So then we are back to the old recipe that was there before. So because that's the recipe that is associated to this ID. So let's go back to our controller and fix these things, and also put back here toggling the window. So let's do that right here. After displaying the success message, we also want to render the bookmark view. And so that will then basically add this new element to the bookmark view dot render. So model dot state dot bookmarks. Okay, and we are not using update here because we really want to insert a new element, and for that we use always render and not the update method. Now the second thing that we wanted to do is to change the ID in the URL, and for that we can use the history API. So let's say change ID in the URL. So we can say window.history, so that is the history API of the browsers, and then on this history object we can call the push state method. And so this will basically allow us to change the URL without reloading the page. Now push state takes 3 arguments, and this first one here is called the state, which doesn't really matter. You can just specify null. Then the second one is a title, which is actually also not relevant, so we can just use an empty string. And then the one that actually is important is the third one, because this one is actually the URL. And so here we can simply put the hash and then the ID that we want to put onto the URL. So that is at model.state.recipe.id, and that's actually it. And we could also do all kinds of other stuff with the history API, like for example going back and forth, just as if we were clicking the forward and back buttons in the browser. So we could do like this. Of course, it doesn't make sense in this situation, but maybe in some other situation you might find this one helpful. So automatically going back to the last page. So that should work now, but let's not test it yet, because the next thing that we want to do is to refactor these two methods here, these two functions. So getJSON and sendJSON are almost the same right now, and so we can basically put them together just in one function called AJAX, because both of them are being done for doing an AJAX request. So just like this. And then this one will receive the URL and also the upload data, but we will set this one to undefined by default. And so with this, when we call this AJAX function with only the URL, then of course there is no upload data, and then in that case we can simply define the fetch pro as only this. So let's actually do that. So conditionally defining this fetch pro variable. So fetch pro, and let's test if upload data does exist. So if it does exist, then fetch pro should become this. So let's grab that, put that here. And otherwise, it will simply be this. And that's it. Now, of course, I could have used an if-else statement, but then I would have had to declare this here as a let variable outside, and then change that variable in both the blocks, and that's not really nice. And so now we can basically copy everything else here. Then we don't need this one anymore, and this should go all the way to the top. And that's actually it. So let's comment this one out. Just one final look, but everything looks good here. And so here now we can no longer import this one. Let's just keep it there. And we simply import AJAX. So here, and here, and then down here for upload the recipe, the same thing. Okay, so let's try that. And we see that we still get the recipe. We also get the search, and now finally let's add another test 23 recipe here. Let's just change it up a little bit. And now again, take a look what happens to the ID here. So you saw that it actually changed. And so now the ID of our new recipe is exactly that one that we have here. And also it should now be a new bookmark. And indeed it is. Okay. And so now if we reload this page, then you see that we are back at this recipe that we just created. Great. But now finally let's use our keys or key in order to actually mark this recipe here as our own recipe by displaying like a small icon here. And so for that we need to attach our key to all the API queries. So we can add the key to this one here simply by adding the key, and of course also to this one, so the one which has the ID. So again at the end, question mark and then the key. Okay, so let's simply get this one here. So this one is for the search results. Let's add this here. And here we already have a parameter. So here it is then end. So search and key. But then, yeah, for this one, so for loading the recipe, there is nothing yet there. And so we can simply add our key like this. And so now by adding this key, especially in the search results, it will then load all the recipes, including the ones that contain our own key. So if I search for avocado now, because I have, well, not here in the demo, but in this one, so I created a recipe which contains avocado. And so if I search for avocado now, that should then contain this recipe that I just created. All right. Now, we now want to mark this as our own recipe again, here in the search results and also here. And so let's do that. And just as a side note, again, if you're using your own API key, then of course you will not see this recipe here, because this recipe is linked to my API key. So as we see right here. So this is the key that I am using. All right. And the same here in the results. So here in all the results, you will see that my own one has the key. So this first one, right? So test avocado, it has my key, but the other ones, of course, do not. But anyway, let's now go to the recipe view and also the preview view. So the one responsible for these results, and add the logic there to actually display that small icon there. So we don't need this one anymore, and neither this one. So recipe view and preview view. So the code for that is somewhere there at the top. Here it is. So user generated. And I guess I wrongly deleted some code here earlier. So let's go back to the HTML and copy it back like this. And now the indentation is messed up. Then here we need to replace that with icons once again. And so now all we will do with this element here is to basically add the hidden class if there is no key on the recipe. But if there is a key, then we will add no class. And so then it will become visible. Okay, so that's simply this dot data dot key. So if there is a key, then we want to add no class at all. But if there is no key, then we add the hidden class. Okay, And now the same here in the preview view. And actually here we don't even have that yet. So let's actually grab the same code from the recipe view, because it is almost the same. And let's just see that here to see where we have to paste it. Well, it's not here, so let's just paste it anywhere. So let's put it right here. And then it's probably going to call it preview user generated. All right. Or actually, I think that it is inside of this div here. So let's move that down a little bit. Fix the indentation here once again to make it easier to see. Just like this. All right. And so let's now try it out. So let's search for avocado here again. And then here it is. And you see that now we have this icon here. While if we click some other recipe, then it's not there. All right. Now it's only still missing here, but that is because we actually never added this key to the search data. So let's go back to our model. And so here in the load search results, this is where we create the data that will then be put in the state, right? So state.search.results will become these objects here. And so that only contains ID, title, publisher, and image, but not the key. And so let's grab this code that we used here in order to add the key to the recipe object and do that here as well. Right, then here we just have to change this to rec, just like all the others here. And then with that, we should be good to go. So let's see. Search for avocado one more time. And now it is there. You see? Great. So again, this one does not have the icon, while this one here, of course, now has. So right here. Beautiful. So this is just great. Let me now close this here and create one final, more real recipe here for pizza that we have been using all the time. So let me get rid of all of these weird bookmarks. Oh, and you see that also here we now have this icon, right? And so that's the beauty of using the same preview here in the results and also for the bookmarks, right? So that makes everything really more reusable. What's happening here? Okay. Just getting rid of all of them because these recipes are not really that interesting. So let's now add a super pizza. Then the URL, let's make it jonas.io. So that's https jonas.io. Then let's go to Unsplash and grab some image from there, just to make this, again, a little bit more real world. So this one here looks quite nice. So let's right click and copy image address. Okay. Then here, Jonas, Schmettmann, prep time 75 minutes, 2 servings. And here let's just use 1 kilogram of flour, then some tomato sauce, and the rest doesn't really matter. Okay, so looks correct. Let's upload it. And it was successful. And here we get the super pizza. Let's see here. And indeed, we can update our servings here. we are in the bookmarks, and if I now search for pizza, then here it appears right at the first position with this beautiful image. And so that means that our application is now basically finished. I just spotted a small bug here. So in this ingredient description, remember that we replaced all the spaces. And so with that, we lost the space between tomato sauce. So let's quickly go fix that, but I will not add another recipe. So we're not going to test this. All I will do is to fix this problem down here. So instead of this replace all here, let's do it differently. So I will split the string into multiple parts, which will then return an array, and then I will loop over that array and trim each of the elements. So map to create a new array. Let's just call it element here, and then just return element.trim, just like this. Okay, and so now if we add just something to test here, so adding some spaces here and maybe here and here. And so you see, this worked just fine now. Well, now we have two recipes for some reason. Not sure why that was, but you see that the spaces that I inserted there, they are gone. Okay, let's remove this one here. I don't want to see that again. And so, yeah, our application is now feature complete. So if we check out our flowchart part 3, everything here is now implemented. And that's just awesome. So congratulations for going through this huge, huge project together with me and making it all the way to the end. And now in the next final lecture of the section, I will just quickly show you how we can write documentations for functions in order to make other people understand our code a little bit better. And then, just like before, I have some final suggestions for you, so like features and improvements that you will be able to implement on yourself if you want to practice your skills. So I hope to see you there soon. Welcome to the last video of this project. And so let's finish this section by learning a little bit about how we can write some documentation for our code in order to make our code easy to understand also for other people. And then at the end of the video, I will again show you some challenges and some improvements that you can implement on this application on your own. So there is a standard way of writing documentation for JavaScript functions, and that is called JSDocs. So let me choose one function here for which I'm going to write some documentation, and that's going to be this render function. So this one. So of course, I'm not going to document now the entire code base, but let me just show you how it works with this function here. And we can also go to jsdoc.app. So that's jsdoc.app. And so here you can find some more information besides what I'm going to show you now. So to write documentation, we basically write a multi-line comment like this, and then a second star. And then you see that automatically a JSDoc comment is initialized here. And so if we hit enter, then you see that already this has pre-filled some code here. You see? So data and render are actually already the parameters that we have here. So VS Code automatically found them, right? But let's start with a quick description of this function. Let's say render the received object to the DOM. Then here the data, we can describe it inside of these curly braces. So we can say that we expect an object here, or we also expect an array of objects. And so that is represented with the OR symbol here, and then again object, and then array. So again, this means that we are expecting an array of objects. Then this here is the name of the parameter. And then here after that, we can also write a short description. So the data to be rendered. For example, a recipe. Okay, then we have render here as well. And so here again, we can define its type. And this one is a Boolean. Now this parameter is actually optional. And so we can put that here inside of these brackets. And we can also specify then here the default value like this. So another description here. So if false, create markup string instead of rendering to the DOM. Now you might ask, what is the big advantage of this? And of course, the most obvious one is that if you're working with someone else on your project, they can now more easily understand what exactly your function is doing. Because this standard way of writing it, everyone understands, or at least everyone that is familiar with this JSDoc format. Because if everyone describes their function in the same way using the standard, then that becomes really easy for everyone to understand the documentation of each other. Now, what's also great about this is that JavaScript, or actually VS Code, takes this data, and then when we hover over the function, it will take that data and give us this nice overview of the function. So here you can see that the parameter is data, and then with the description, and here the same, also the description for render. Here we can also see that the render is optional, so we have this question mark, and it should be a Boolean. Okay, and then for the data, we can also see that it receives any or an array of any type. And the same happens when we take a look at that in some other file. So it looks a little bit different, but the main information is still here. Okay, but we can add more than just the description of these parameters. For example, we can also write or describe what this function returns. And so usually it doesn't return anything, and so that's then undefined, but it might also be a string. And so that's in case that render here is set to false, right? So let's write that here. Is returned if render is false. Next, we can also define the this keyword. So I think this is another interesting one. And so here the this keyword points to the view object itself. So let's just write view object. So let's see what happens then. Oh, and here object is basically the description. So here it expects the type basically. So let's actually put here that it is an object. And so then here we can say that it's a view, let's say instance. All right, so that makes more sense. And here you already can see that the function is going to return either undefined or a string. So let's try another one. And you see there are a lot of different options. And again, you can check them out in the website that I just showed you. But another one that I like is the author. And so here you can put your own name. And just to finish, there is another one called to do. And so here we can specify everything that we still need to do. Let's just say finish the implementation. And so again, when we come here, it then contains all of this data, and the same when we see it here. All right. And so in your own projects, you can go ahead and add maybe not all of this, but at least part to some of your functions, like at least the most important ones, so that when you come back to them in like 1 or 5 years or so, that you then still know what exactly they do. and what data they get in and what they output. All right, and that's it for this project. Now here in package.json, remember we also have this build command. So basically to actually build the final project files, like with compression and tree shaking and all of that, before we then deploy it to a server. But we will actually do that in the next section. And so for now, let's leave it like this and really call this application finished now. However, before we go, once again, I have a couple of ideas for features and improvements that you can implement in this application. So let's start with some easy changes and then all the way to really complex feature additions. So to start, you could display the number of pages between the two pagination buttons. And so with that, the user would then immediately know how many pages there are, which is a little bit more user-friendly. Also about the search results, you could add the ability for the user to sort the search results by the duration or by the number of ingredients of the found recipes. However, that data is actually not available on the search results, well, unless I do some changes to the API, I guess. So maybe I might do that so that you can actually implement this idea here. Otherwise, you would have to basically get this information for all of the recipes in the search results. But that would require quite a lot of work and also a lot of API calls. Next, another thing that you could do is to perform the validation of ingredients right in the view, so before actually submitting the form. So for example, while the user is inputting the ingredients, you could warn them ahead of time that, for example, the format is wrong. And so that would then, again, be a little bit more user-friendly. Also, maybe alternatively, you could actually improve the input of the ingredients. So instead of having the quantity, unit, and description all in one field, you could add a different field for these 3 data points and then read all that data into your application. And besides that, you could also allow for more than 6 ingredients. So there's a lot to improve, I guess, here in the add recipe functionality. But of course, here in the videos, I had to keep it kind of simple in order not to make like a 20-hour project. Okay, so these are some of the more simpler improvements you can make. And now let's talk about 4 additional features that could be implemented in this application. And the first one would be a shopping list feature. So somewhere on each recipe, you could have a button which would then add all the ingredients of that recipe to some kind of list. And so you could then display that list on the user interface, for example, in another hidden panel in the menu bar, besides the bookmarks, for example. And so that list would then contain all of the ingredients that you might add from different recipes. And actually, the original version of Forkify that I had in my previous course had this functionality. But in this version 2, I had to remove that feature in order to make place for the add recipe functionality, which is new and which I think is way more important. Now, the next feature that you can try to implement is a weekly meal planning feature. So you can make this as crazy as you would like, but in the easiest form, you would simply assign recipes to the next 7 days and then show them somewhere on a weekly calendar. And for this one, you could add like a drop-down menu to each of the recipes, and from there choose which of the next 7 days you want to assign that recipe to. And then in the menu bar, you could again have like a panel which shows the next 7 days, and then which of the recipes was assigned to each day. But of course, you could make it also a lot more complex. This is just the first simple implementation that comes to my mind. And now finally, so actually I only have 3 features for you, not 4. And this last one is the most complex one, and it is to get nutrition data for each ingredient of a certain recipe from a special food API. And the best API for food that I know is the Spoonacular API. So you could check out their website and their documentation, and from there, for each of the ingredients, for example, get the calories. And then you could calculate the total calories of one recipe and maybe also per serving. And there is a lot of other different and interesting stuff that you could do with this application together with the Spoonacular API. So the possibilities are endless here if you want to have some fun. All right? So these are just some of my suggestions, but I'm sure that you can come up with even more. So I've seen really creative stuff from students of this course in other projects. And hopefully you can come up with some of your own as well. And with this, we now actually reach the end of this biggest project of this course. And I hope that you had as much fun building it as I had while going through this together with you. And this is really a great, great achievement. Really well done. Congratulations. So even if you just coded along with me, you still learned a tremendous amount of skills throughout this project. And of course, throughout the entire last 50 or 60 hours of course videos. And now I would really love to see your implementation of at least a couple of these challenges that I just showed you here. Because I think that they will be really beneficial for your own learning. And so maybe you can take some hours when you have the time and really continue practicing your skills here. And if you do that, then please make sure to share some of your screenshots of the implementations that you do on Twitter. So I really would love to see that. But anyway, it's actually not time to say goodbye to this project yet, because in the next section, we will deploy this project onto a live server so that you can then share it with the world and with everyone that you know. So there is still a lot of interesting stuff to learn. So when you're ready implementing these challenges, then let's go to the next section.